You've heard the stories, the bearded warriors in long ships, the thunder of axes, the villages burning. But there is a part of Viking life that textbooks and TV shows tend to skip, the rituals behind closed doors, where sex, power, and death were all part of the same performance. You belong to the man who captured you, not as a wife, not as a servant, as property. You are expected to serve him sexually whenever he demands, and if you resist, your life holds no more legal weight than a cracked bowl. In fact, in the eyes of Viking law, you are a cracked bowl, damaged goods that can be discarded. Historians have uncovered law codes from Iceland and Norway that differentiate punishment based on a woman's status. Rape of a free woman might mean death for the attacker, but rape of a slave? That was a fine, usually the same cost as damaging someone's shirt. What if I told you that Viking sexuality wasn't just primal, it was political, religious, and horrifying? One wrong move in the bedroom could make you an outlaw. And we're not just talking about adultery. We're talking about power positions. In Norse culture, the man who penetrated was seen as dominant, masculine, worthy. The one who was penetrated, even metaphorically, was considered weak, effeminate, shameful. Ritualistically, symbolically, sometimes sexually. So shameful, in fact, that just accusing a man of being passive in sex could get you killed. That meant that after the bride and groom were married, they had to consummate the union immediately. Not alone, but with witnesses. Sometimes family members would stand outside the door, listening for sounds of sex to confirm the act had happened. In certain cases, someone, usually a trusted relative, would stay in the room and actually watch. If no proof of consummation could be presented, the marriage could be declared invalid, and the bride's family could demand their dowry back to break their identity. If the bride wasn't a virgin or the groom couldn't perform, lawsuits could follow. The law even laid out specific financial penalties for different kinds of sexual failure. It wasn't about love. It was about lineage, reputation, economics. It was about theft. You took something from your victim, his pride, his honor, his manhood. Some sagas even describe captured kings being publicly raped to show they were no longer fit to rule. After such acts, these men would often be cast out by their own people, or they'd kill themselves. Anything to escape the shame. One of the most degrading tactics was a practice called klámhögg, shame stroke, where a defeated man's buttocks would be slashed or stabbed, symbolizing that he had been sexually overpowered. It was a mark, a message, and everyone in the tribe would understand what it meant. Literally, Viking legal codes stated that calling someone rhaegar, a term that implied sexual submissiveness, was grounds for legal murder. You could end someone's life for insulting your masculinity and walk free. What if I told you that in the cold north, your body could be used as currency, as punishment, or as a portal to the afterlife? And because Viking society ran on reputation and honor, the damage wasn't just legal, it was generational. Your family name could be tarnished for decades by a single rumor about your bedroom behavior. Let's go back to 10th century Scandinavia. Imagine being a slave girl in a Viking camp, young, stolen, and stripped of every right. But what shocks most modern readers into just the existence of this violence. It is how ritualized, normalized, and strategic it was. Sexual violence wasn't always an outburst. Often it was a display, a message, and sometimes it was a ritual so embedded in belief systems that it was considered sacred. What he witnessed there still disturbs scholars to this day. When a Viking chief died, the tribe began a funeral ritual that included sacrificing animals, crafting a burial ship, and choosing a slave girl to die with him. This wasn't a murder. It was a send-off, a performance, a final offering. Take Viking funerals. She would visit different tents, and in each one she was sexually used by men from the tribe. But they didn't treat it like abuse. They treated it like a spiritual transfer. One man was reported saying, "Tell your master I did this out of love." This was their way of passing energy to the dead. Her body became a vessel for the living to communicate with the afterlife. And when her final hour came, an old woman known as the Angel of Death would lead her to the funeral ship, where she was strangled and stabbed before being burned with the chief's corpse. This wasn't hidden. It wasn't secret, it was ceremony. In 921 AD, an Arab diplomat named Ahmad ibn Fadlan was sent to the land of the Rus Norsemen who had settled in what now Russia. The girl, often drugged or intoxicated, was paraded through the camp, and it wasn't the only time Viking sex and violence merged in full public view. In Viking society, your sexual role determined your social role. The consequences weren't just social, they were institutional. A man branded with sexual passivity could lose the right to testify in court, inherit land, or even bear arms. This obsession with dominance ran deep in their warfare, too. Vikings didn't just want to defeat their enemies, they wanted to humiliate them. There is evidence from both sagas and grave sites that warriors who were captured were subjected to acts of sexualized violence, not for gratification, but for deconstruction. Because in Viking logic, sexual dominance wasn't about pleasure. Even in marriage, sex wasn't private. It was politics. A Viking wedding wasn't a cozy affair. It was a community contract, and that contract required proof. To make things worse, the bed sheets from the wedding night were often inspected and stored like legal documents. And if you think that was shocking, wait until we talk about what happened when these marriages fell apart, especially when Viking women took control. Viking women, especially those born free, had more power than almost any other women in medieval Europe. They could own land. They could divorce their husbands. And perhaps most radically, they could destroy a man's reputation with just a few carefully chosen words. That wasn't just an insult. It was a power play. If a man failed to perform sexually or worse, performed submissively, it called his entire masculinity into question. And once that public doubt was cast, the consequences spiraled fast. Other men might challenge his authority. He might lose political influence. He could even lose his land. One public accusation about a husband's performance in bed could reduce him to a legal and social outcast. Not because it was gossip, but because it was considered legitimate evidence. They weren't wives. They had no legal protections, and any violence committed against them, sexual or otherwise, wasn't considered a crime. At best, it was a property dispute. Archaeological studies in Viking settlements like Dublin suggest that as much as 30% of the population were slaves and many were taken specifically for sexual use. Viking raiding wasn't just about conquest. It was about trafficking. Raiders would sometimes subject their prisoners, especially male warriors, to humiliating acts designed to erase their masculinity. This wasn't about pleasure. It was about annihilation. That insult sparked a chain of killings that wiped out multiple families. That wasn't just toxic masculinity, it was codified, ritualized, weaponized masculinity. Raping a slave? That came with a fine usually paid to the slave's owner, not to the victim. In Viking eyes, the body of a slave woman wasn't her own, it was her master's asset. Though he was the all-powerful ruler of Asgard, Odin's dabbling in feminine arts made him vulnerable to accusations of unmanliness. In the poetic Edda, other gods mock him for it. What mattered wasn't who you slept with, it was how. The penetrative partner maintained his honor. The receptive one lost it. That was the line. That was the code. And it defined Viking sexual politics at every level of society, from slaves and farmers to kings and gods. He even gave birth to a horse at one point. These weren't just parties, they were spectacles, and in some cases, sexual violence was part of the entertainment. And while that may sound like mythological nonsense to Viking men, it was more than a joke. Adulterers could be castrated on stage with the punishment treated like a sporting event. Some sagas describe tournaments where prisoners were subjected to escalating sexual torture, while spectators placed bets on how long the victims would last before breaking. Remains show signs of mutilation slashes across the pelvis, fractures consistent with restraint. and sometimes objects inserted post-mortem. These weren't just murders. They were performances of dominance, public displays of sexual power. It was a warning. Loki's behavior made him both feared and ridiculed. His transformations weren't just magical, they were sexual, and they made other gods question his manhood, but to ensure they could never reclaim leadership. Because in Viking belief, being forced into a submissive sexual role meant you lost your hemingja, your luck, your spiritual energy, your social essence. They used sexual humiliation as a strategic weapon, especially during war. Viking men were locked in a constant battle to prove they were dominant, not just on the battlefield, but in the bedroom, the marriage bed, and even in rumors. They were looking for people specifically, people they could sell or use. And at the top of the list were young women. The more attractive, the more valuable. Some were sold into slavery in cities like Dublin or York, where Norse trade networks flourished. Others were kept as concubines for Viking lords passed around, owned, and used. Take the Laxdæla saga, where a woman named Guin divorces her husband because, in her words, he was too gentle in bed. That's how fragile Viking masculinity was. One whisper, one joke, one accusation of passivity could lead to lawsuits, feuds, or bloodshed, and those feuds could be fatal. The Njál's saga describes a decades-long conflict that began with a simple accusation that one man had been bottom in a relationship. And just as Viking men were obsessed with proving dominance, Viking society was obsessed with turning sex into law, ritual, and even business. Let's talk about the slave markets. When Vikings raided coastal villages in England, Ireland, and across Eastern Europe, they weren't just looking for gold. Some sagas describe these women as part of a harem, reserved for the highest-ranking warriors or rulers. In one legal code from medieval Iceland, raping a free woman carried the death penalty. And the scale of this system wasn't small. But Vikings didn't just control others through physical acts. One of the most disturbing practices described in the sagas was the use of ritualized sexual violence as a form of punishment or domination in battle. Captured leaders were often targeted. The Volsunga saga describes defeated kings being stripped, mocked, and publicly degraded, not just to strip them of honor. Even the gods played by these rules. In Norse mythology, Loki, the infamous trickster, was often portrayed as shape-shifting into female forms. Odin, the chief of the gods, was also criticized for practicing seer, a form of magic associated with women. And here's where it gets even stranger. Same-sex encounters were not forbidden in Viking culture. In fact, they were common among raiding crews, where men spent months or years at sea. But perhaps the most surreal blend of sex, religion, and violence came during Viking festivals. Captured enemies might be forced to perform humiliating acts in front of cheering crowds. It was brutality as theater. Execution sites across Scandinavia support these accounts. To the Vikings, this wasn't perversion. It was justice. It was tradition. It was control. And beneath it all was a message. In Viking culture, sex was never just sex. It was war, it was status, it was survival. What happened when two people cared more about each other than the laws of dominance? That's where the contradictions of Viking life begin to unravel. Love in Viking society was not forbidden, but it was inconvenient. It complicated things. Marriage was about land, bloodlines, and contracts. Affection was nice, but optional. And if you let it interfere with your duties, it could destroy you. A man who allowed his feelings to override his role as protector, enforcer, or patriarch could lose everything, not just his lover, but his place in the world. Some sagas, especially those from Iceland, tell of lovers torn apart by family expectations. A woman might be promised to one man for political advantage, but secretly in love with another. These weren't just romantic tragedies. They were dangerous violations of the societal order, because love in Viking eyes was something you couldn't control. And if a man let love soften him, if he let it override his dominance, he risked being seen as weak. If a Viking family couldn't afford to raise a daughter or simply didn't want one, they could legally expose her to the elements. That meant leaving her outside to freeze, starve, or be eaten by animals. This wasn't considered murder. It was a grim form of population control. And it tells us something very uncomfortable. Viking society wasn't built to protect most women. It was built to use them. There's a reason so many Viking sagas end in betrayal, blood feuds, and revenge killings. Personal emotions had to be sacrificed for public honor. The treatment of slave women, by contrast, showed how low a human life could fall once it was stripped of autonomy. Even in myths, love was punished. Think of the goddess Freya associated with love, sex, and fertility. The gap between them was so wide that it wasn't just economic, it was metaphysical. Old values clashed with new morals. And deep down, the idea that sex was power never really left. It just adapted. A free woman's body was her own. A slave woman's body was a tool for someone else's legacy. She was powerful, beautiful, and worshipped across the Norse world. But even she was constantly demeaned by the other gods for her sexuality, and the shame attached to passivity. In the way society links sexual control with social status, you can still trace that dark inheritance back to the Viking world where sex wasn't about love. It was about survival. Slowly, painfully, the laws began to shift. Slave trading declined. Sexual violence became less institutional and more taboo. Priests preached that marriage was about love, not property. Not just on the battlefield, but in the bedroom, the law, and the grave. And the rituals witnessed consummations, funerals with sex and sacrifice, public humiliations, they all started to disappear. They egged on their sons and husbands to avenge insults or dominate rivals. The infamous Queen Gunhild, wife of King Eirik Bloodaxe, was said to have used both seduction and cruelty to maintain control over her court. According to some accounts, she personally ordered the castration of young men who displeased her. Whether the tales are exaggerated or not, the message is clear. Power was respected, even if it was brutal. In the Lokasenna, a poem in the Poetic Edda, Loki insults her for sleeping with too many men and calls her depraved. For all her power, even a goddess wasn't safe from sexual shame. The truth is, Viking culture couldn't tolerate vulnerability, and love is the ultimate vulnerability. And ironically, it was also one of the few times when female power rivaled male. Childbirth was sacred, bloody, and wrapped in superstition. Women who died in childbirth were believed to be taken to a realm called Folkvanger, presided over by Freya herself, a sort of female Valhalla. That sounds beautiful, but it masks a darker truth. This is why so many of their practices focused not on pleasure, but control, not on connection, but power. Take childbirth, for example. Giving birth was one of the most dangerous things a Viking woman could do. While free women had strong legal rights and cultural clout, baby girls often didn't survive infancy. The rights granted to free women only existed to reinforce the value of freedom. This sharp contrast created a brutal hierarchy. Free women could divorce. Slave women couldn't say no. Free women could own ships. Slave women were cargo. And yet, Viking women, even the free ones, often upheld these systems. Some of the most powerful female figures in the sagas encouraged sexual violence. So how did it all end? When Christianity spread through Scandinavia in the 10th and 11th centuries, everything began to change, but they didn't vanish overnight. For centuries, the Viking world lived in a strange hybrid state, half pagan, half Christian. And maybe that's the most disturbing part, because even now, fragments of these beliefs linger, and the pressure men feel to dominate. And now you know the truth. The intimate, disturbing, and deeply political truth of how Viking raiders used sexuality as a tool of conquest. They weren't just warriors. They were engineers of dominance, and their legacy still haunts us.